Hello, everyone. I'm Brittany Moraski. I am board member and advocacy chair for the Seattle Public Library Foundation. I'm really excited to welcome you to today's discussion and webinar. And thank you so much for supporting the foundation and library and being here today. As you may have seen in the introduction, we like to start with a land acknowledgement. The Seattle Public Library is on Indigenous lands. These are the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, specifically Duwamish people, past and present. As we think about libraries and their role in our society, it's good to be grounded in the physical place that libraries also represent. I also have a few housekeeping items before we kick off the conversation. The webinar will feature a conversation between the acclaimed writer Annalee Newitz and our foundation CEO, Brian Lawrence. There will be time for Q&A, and you'll have the opportunity to submit your Q&A by using the Q&A feature through Zoom. So tee it up and submit them at any time, and Brian will work them into the conversation. If you have any issues from a technical nature, including captions, use the chat feature and a member of our team will assist you. And we are recording this conversation so that there will be opportunity to share it with others in the future. So obviously libraries matter to all of you and to us. That's why we're here today. This conversation is really going to help us think about the role that libraries can play in supporting our democracy, strengthening our communities. And I and others, all of us here, hope that this reinforces your support of the library. And at the end of the conversation, I'll speak to some ways you may consider getting involved, perhaps beyond what you're already doing to support the library. With that, I'll hand it over to the CEO of the Seattle Public Library Foundation, Brian Lawrence, to start the event.
All right. Well, thank you, Brittany. By the way, I love your background. We had a great event with Partners in Print where we did those letterpress posters that are behind you. So great that you have that as your background today. So, and thank you, Brittany, and all of our board members and emeritus board members who are with us, as well as all of you from the public and our amazing group of donors who always support our foundation. So. We are excited to kick off our first event of 2025 with all of you. As Brittany mentioned, we heard from a number of supporters last year when Annalee Newitz published her article in the Washington Post. And you can tell it's going to be a really interesting topic when lots of people email us and say, we would love to hear from this author. So I want to now welcome and introduce Annalee Newitz. So Annalee, can you join us on screen? So welcome.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
And you're joining us today from our lovely neighbors of the north in Vancouver. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm up here for a couple months, so I'm enjoying the perma-gray.
All right. All right. Well, we're excited to have you in the Northwest. And by the way, we were trying to figure out how we could get you here, but timing was just a little tight. So we decided we're going to make this a virtual event and welcome all of our donors, no matter where they are, and they can join us from the comfort of their living rooms. So,
yeah.
So Annalee, we're excited about your book. You're a science fiction writer, and you're also a nonfiction writer. So you're multi-talented, and you've written 3 novels, and you're a recipient of the Lambda Literary Award, which is pretty impressive. And as a science journalist, you've written 3 other books. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic.
That's correct. Yeah.
And you've been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker, and many other outlets that all of our guests today typically enjoy with us. You're also the co-host of the Hugo Award-winning podcast, Our Opinions Are Correct, and you're a regular public radio contributor. So very impressive credentials as a writer and a thought leader in our community. So we're thrilled to have you.
Yeah, I mean, thank you again. And thanks also to Will and Brittany for putting this together. And yeah, really appreciate you guys making space for me to come in.
Great, great. Well, we'll jump right in. So let's start with your book, Stories Are Weapons. What inspired you to write?
So as a science journalist, I write a lot about, the environment and ancient history, and so I had become really interested in the ways in which um, politics and things that you can't really study using graphs and charts and scientific instruments, how those things, how politics, how culture kind of affect the way we see history. And that's kind of how it started. And the book is really a history of psychological operations and culture wars, ways in which people try to influence each other with stories in the United States specifically. And so I have to admit, when I first started it, it's one of the hardest books I've ever written because I couldn't just go to a lab and have someone, take out a scientific instrument and say, here it is, we can see propaganda affecting people's minds. You can't measure it other than to kind of take the temperature of your culture, using vibes, basically, using discussions with other people. And so as I was working on it, the pandemic happened. And so we were just inundated with a flood of disinformation. And that really kicked me into high gear. And that was kind of the beginning of the book as it is now. So it's been kind of a long journey, and it's unfortunately becoming even more relevant, I think.
Yeah, you bet. You bet. And I just love it was so interesting when we talked before this call, just hearing your passion for history as well as your sort of interest in science, and how they intersect and brought you to the place of writing this book. So talking about the role of books, both attempts to ban them and efforts to increase access and circulation, which is something obviously we stand for here in Seattle. But talk to us about the role that books play in the quote psychological warfare aspect to our culture wars.
Yeah. So what really interested me when I was looking at US history was that we have these kind of parallel tracks in our public sphere. And when I say public sphere, I don't mean anything fancy. I just kind of mean the realm of ideas and stories and media that we're sharing with each other, wherever we're sharing it, whether it's backyard gossip or, over social media or movies or whatever. So I became interested in how there are state-sponsored messages, made by governments, that, local, national governments that are intended to persuade people and sometimes to coerce people. And that kind of falls into the realm of psychological war. And psychological war, it is a military doctrine, it is a military practice, and it's intended to be aimed at foreign adversaries. We're not supposed to be engaging in psyops against our own people. But there's this tremendous spillover effect, really in the middle of the 20th century when we see the rise of the Cold War, where a lot of techniques that were developed in the military start to get used by the US government against the American people. And I'm thinking specifically about the anti-communist trials overseen by McCarthy, as well as the anti-queer trials, the Lavender Scare, where lots of government workers who were LGBT were fired for being queer. And so suddenly, culture war, which is kind of this amorphous thing where Americans are arguing with each other and having moral panics, starts to look a lot like a military psychological war, where lots of threats are being made against people's livelihoods or even their lives. And so to bring it back to books, what really interested me was this, like I said, this kind of cross-pollination that's happening between the more amorphous realm of culture and the more focused realm of military psyops. And there's one particularly interesting figure who works in the military during World War II. His name is Paul Linebarger, and that was his real name, but in his life as a science fiction writer, he wrote under the name Cordwainer Smith. And so he had this double life as a guy who worked in psyops. He wrote the first Army guide to psychological warfare, which is called Psychological Warfare. It's a very basic title.
Yeah.
It's available online for free. It's public resource now. Um, but at the same time, he's writing science fiction. And his idea is that stories that we get from books can help us tell, can basically help us make propaganda. And he starts to codify this idea that some of the tools of storytelling, like world building, like character development, help us frame propaganda better and make it more effective.
Mhm.
And so books become, especially during the Cold War, this kind of site of moral panic. And you start to see things like government hearings about comic books. You start to see in the 1950s, there was a movement very, very similar to Moms for Liberty, which was focused on clearing high school libraries out of any books that might have a whiff of communism or a whiff of gayness. Um, that was more in the realm of comic books, which you didn't really see so much in school libraries. But there was this very similar moment happening in the US where books were under fire, and librarians were under fire. And it was only, a few years before that the ALA comes up with their code of ethics, right, in the heart of World War II in 1939. And so libraries have this kind of sense of a code of ethics, wanting to push back, and wanting to protect this public sphere created by the library, where there's many books full of many ideas. And then there are government forces and kind of cultural forces pushing back and saying, no, no, really the government and government adjacent groups should be the ones picking books and making those books available. And I think, we've come right back to that place now. And it's really instructive to look at that history and think about how we navigated it before,
Mhm.
and what role books played there and libraries.
And sort of fascinating because you can look at books and then you can sort of look at the increasing efforts to take that from, book bans into attacks on libraries as institutions, and social institutions themselves. So, what do you think of libraries in terms of becoming a target as well?
I mean, libraries are a kind of public sphere, and I think I keep bringing up the term public sphere because I think when we're thinking about books and other media, they are kind of the fabric of our public sphere, the culture that we swim in, the way that we talk to each other about all of our feelings and beliefs. And libraries offer this model of the public sphere, which is in many ways, very, very open, much more open
Yep.
in a lot of ways than, say, television. There are books that are propaganda. There's books that are, deeply researched histories. There's memoirs. There's anime, available as, video. There's all kinds of stuff. And at the same time, we're seeing, especially right now, a very different model of the public sphere being proposed by the current presidential regime and also by our current, biggest sources of media, like, say, Meta, which owns Facebook, or X, which used to be Twitter. Um, these kinds of public spheres are really constrained. Either they're constrained by political ideology, so there's only certain things that you can say and not be sued, or they're constrained by advertising. And they're kind of shot through with advertising. So you can't gain access to knowledge without also clicking through like 17 ads for like soap and underwear. And like, well, that tells you
Hmm.
what kind of ads I get. I get a lot of ads
Depends on
for
what you
soap.
look at, right?
Yeah, so I love smelly soap, so I get a lot of ads for that. But anyway, so um, I think that what we're seeing, these attacks that we're seeing on libraries, and this is what I argued in the piece in the Washington Post, it's not just an attack on specific books, although it's also that. It's an attack on a way of approaching how we share information. It's an attack on a space that isn't beholden to commercial interests necessarily, a space where people are allowed to guide themselves through the media that's offered. I mean, of course, with the help of librarians if they ask, but if you don't ask the librarian, you can just browse. And there's no algorithm kind of picking books out for you and smashing you in the face with them, which is kind of how algorithms always feel to me. Like someone's just like smacking me in the head over and over again as I try to like actually find something that I want
Hmm.
to look at. Um, and I think that's extremely challenging for an authoritarian public sphere, which is very controlled, which is all about guiding you into a very specific experience of what it means to read, to learn. And I think the attacks that we're seeing, they are going to escalate. They are going to be coming from people who are afraid of people just um, browsing information, learning things opportunistically, following their instincts, and just saying, like, you know what, I really like frogs. I'm going to look at books about frogs. Oh, I found books about salamanders too. Whoa, salamanders! Like,
Uh,
that is the scariest scenario, I think, in some ways, that we will just discover on our own new information that is not in keeping with what the dominant regime would like us to see.
Yeah. And that leads me to my next question is when we think about sort of the concept of misinformation, and,
Hmm.
you mentioned Meta earlier and some of their efforts to sort of not, take a step back from their ability to kind of flag things as misinformation on their platform. And then you also think about sort of like political propaganda as well as like AI generated content, which is a new era that we're finding ourselves in now. And so as you think about sort of like those three components, and you think about the structure of a library, how do you see the sort of the institution cutting through that noise?
I mean, there's a lot of different ways. One of the most pernicious aspects of misinformation on social media is the way it spreads virally. So, again, to go back to this idea of the algorithm kind of smacking you in the face, you will come across disinformation without ever asking for it.
Yeah,
Now, you could go to the library and say, like, I would like books that are, full of I'll pick on homeopathic medicine. No shade on people who want to do homeopathic medicine, but it isn't very evidence-based at this point. So you could go to the library and say, like, I want to look at that stuff. I want to look at books about astrology or other things that are not evidence-based, and you can seek them out, and a librarian can help you find them. But if you go online, you're going to be exposed to all kinds of disinformation and pseudoscience, even if you're looking for what you would consider evidence-based or
sure.
science-based information. So I think one way that the library cuts through that is simply by actually giving patrons what they're truly looking for, not misdirecting them. Because part of misinformation is that it's misdirection. You look for information about vaccines, but you get sidelined into information about how vaccines are bad. Um, and so I think part of that is, again, the way the library is structured. Part of that is the fact that there's librarians.
Hmm.
When you're alone on Facebook, let's pick on Facebook, um, there's no person that you can turn to say, like, where did this come from? Like, who wrote that? Because you get so much stuff that's decontextualized. And I feel like the library is just a radical exercise in contextualization, which is amazing that I have to call that radical. That like
Yeah, yeah,
providing context
yeah,
is like so wild. But in a library, you will see the full context of the book where something has come from, or the full context of the film or other media. You'll have a person there who can help you understand the provenance of the book, like who might be able to say, this book was written by somebody during the Civil War who was in favor of slavery. And so that's where they're coming from. Um, or you also have the contextualization of history, like many things in the library. Everything in the library has a copyright. So you know when it was written and when it came from. So again, that provides a huge amount of context. And you never lose sight of who the author is. You always know who wrote that thing and where it came from. So I think that that's a huge, important part. The other thing that's uh, incredibly important, of course, is that libraries do give us an opportunity to quietly examine multiple points of view, not have anyone yelling at us and telling us which is right and which is wrong. And we can really truly decide for ourselves. Just put a stack of books on the table,
Yeah.
read through them and think about it quietly, or, mumble to yourself. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be quiet. It just needs to be a place where no one is badgering you
Yeah.
about what your opinion is or what their opinion is.
Yeah. One of the things I love reminding folks and um, being on the foundation side, I'm not a librarian, but we work with a lot of librarians, and you're consistently aware that librarianship is really a science. It is really a
Mm-hmm.
science, and these professionals are well trained to be able to direct people to the information and resources they need to answer the questions that they're looking. So I love the fact that librarians approach their work with like a curiosity and a the ability to want to connect you to what it is you're looking for. Um, your book examines like different ways of presenting stories as an alternative to our current culture, which is sometimes contentious. And you've done a lot of work on indigenous systems of knowledge and storytelling. So, what could public libraries learn from in this process that you call like psychological disarmament?
Yeah, so I was to explain what psychological disarmament means for just a second, I was really struggling with this model in the book of thinking about psychological war and culture war because we don't really have any models of how to end those kinds of wars. Like we have lots of models of how do you end a kinetic war, like you have a ceasefire, you have peace talks, there's these
Yeah,
formal mechanisms that are in place. But how do you end a culture war? We need language for that. And so I came up with psychological disarmament as a way of talking about how you de-escalate from a culture war. And so one of the examples that I use in the book is uh, indigenous archives as an example of psychological disarmament because many indigenous nations, well, I should say all indigenous nations and tribes during the 19th century and throughout a large part of the 20th century were the victims of not just kinetic war, but also extreme psychological war.
for sure.
If you think of the classic example from the Cold War of what a psychological war looks like, it's brainwashing, which is, we could get into whether brainwashing is a real thing, but we do know that in the 19th and 20th centuries, indigenous kids were taken away from their families and essentially brainwashed in residential schools and turned into people who didn't feel a connection in many cases with their traditions and their traditional languages, and were really transformed psychologically and in many cases brutalized psychologically. And there's lots and lots of ways in which storytelling during the 19th and 20th century by white settlers about indigenous people also did a kind of cultural violence to indigenous traditions. One of the things I call out in the book is the classic novel from the 1830s, The Last of the Mohicans, which
Hmm.
was a huge hit at the time and continues to be read in school, continues to have movies made based on it. And even the title itself, this idea that there's only one Mohican left and he's the guy in this story, is in fact a story that is a falsehood. It's disinformation. It's pretending as if the Mohican nation and tribes uh, disappeared during the 19th century because of, westward expansion of white settlers. And in fact, the many Mohicans out there are probably scratching their heads and wondering who this last Mohican is because
Hmm.
they don't exist yet. There is no last Mohican. But that kind of story, this idea that indigenous people can be sort of brainwashed into being white white or Western, or that they're disappearing naturally in the face of Western culture. Those are all these harmful stories that are part of this culture war, this psychological war. So this brings me to the importance of Indigenous archives as a form of psychological de-escalation, a way of trying to end that psychological war on Indigenous groups. And there's a huge movement now among librarians and scholars to gather historical documents together into archives that can be accessed both by tribal members but also from outside. And some of these documents come from the tribes themselves. They're things that from elders, they're things that have been written down, oral histories, audio of oral histories, but a lot of it is also government documents produced by white settlers and anthropologists who were producing tons and tons of information about tribes and nations as they were being as we were making war on them. And there are all of these documents that are just locked up in these, not locked up, but like sort of put
Sure,
away in
sure.
dusty
Yep.
corners that a number of Indigenous scholars are now retrieving from national archives, also from local BIA offices. And so I talked a lot to Jason Yonker, who is the chief of the Coquel tribe, and he's also an anthropologist at the University of Oregon in Eugene, and he's worked since the 1990s with the Coquel tribe, but also a bunch of other local tribes in the area in Southwest Oregon to gather a bunch of documents from the National Archives, from the Smithsonian, and other local places, just to have together in an archive to tell a history of the local tribes in Southwest Oregon, who were all removed from their ancestral lands, under the gun, literally. And I visited the archive, which is called the Southwest Oregon Research Project, or SWARP. So it is a great name. And it is a wonderful and actually moving history of these tribes with records of their stories and their language. There's photographs. And then at the end of the archive's history, like as we get to the present, um, there's records of how this group of graduate students that Jason Yonker was part of got the information and then had a potlatch to give the archive to the university. They also have their own copy. A lot of the local tribes have their own copies of the archive as well. Um, and it was the first time that they'd had a potlatch in that region for at least 100 years because that
Mm,
had been outlawed and discouraged by white settler governments. And so it was just this incredible story of of reclaiming history, but also integrating the creation of an archive with indigenous traditions of the potlatch. I think that's just one way to do
yep.
it. But the reason why it's such a healing process is because part of the violence that's done during a culture war is taking history away from the people who it belongs to. And so being able to have that history and to possess it in a way that you can also choose to give it away, it's extremely empowering. And it's a very important part of librarianship because what libraries do is hopefully make those kinds of histories available for many kinds of groups, even groups who can no longer speak for themselves, and make that history available to other people who can then see, okay, that what happened there was terrible. We need to know that history so that we
Sure,
can
sure.
understand how great these tribes were, but also how horrific the wars were as well. So I think that's a great model, like I said, of just like how librarianship can work. And I encourage you all to check out SWARP or check out local Indigenous archives in the Seattle area too.
Yeah, and I think, when I first joined the Library Foundation a few years ago, we did a major exhibition over time called Beyond the Frame. And we were working on showcasing both sides of the Edward Curtis photos and what history taught us from that. And even when we we do our land acknowledgement today. We ask people to sort of use library resources, and SBL's special collections team are really amazing. So if you ever have questions about any of the local history of the tribes, do feel free to book an appointment with Seattle's special collections team, and they can help connect you to some really great resources. You've also said that libraries, quote, provide us with a mental model for a public sphere in which Americans debate each other as equals to reach a resolution and or compromise. And I thought that was a brilliant quote. Share more about sort of expand on how libraries play that role.
Yeah, so I've been kind of talking about that in bits and pieces throughout our conversation. And I think that, as I said, I think that libraries are a part of the public sphere. They create their own little mini public sphere. And I think any librarian knows that um, libraries are places where people go to read books and consume other media, but of course, they're also places where people do everything. Like everything we do in public happens in a library, for better or for worse. And so they truly are third spaces,
Yeah,
places that are not home or work, but we're still gathering there. And they provide this kind of social infrastructure for people. And the reason why I think it makes a really good model for democracy is some of what I was already talking about with the ways in which libraries are structured around the idea that you guide yourself through the process of discovery and learning. Of course, with that, a librarian can help, and it's really important that they're there to provide that help. But it's a place where we're invited to consider many points of view, some of which may make us extremely uncomfortable.
for sure.
But we do it without anyone trying to suggest which is better. And I don't want to, I mean, this is obviously a very idealized picture of a
Yeah, no,
library. I'm very mindful of what Fobazi Itar talks about in her work on vocational awe, which is to say, kind of putting librarians on this pedestal as if they're perfect people and they don't sometimes screw up really massively. Libraries are imperfect, but when they are functioning at their best, if someone comes in and says, I want to learn about gender, a good librarian and a good library will be like, here's a range of books that explain gender from many different points of view, from many different points in history, from different people. And there's going to be books from the point of view of transgender people, books from the point of view of, really conservative people who believe in traditional gender roles. And you will be given that opportunity to think about those points of view and find yourself between them. And I think that's a terrific model for how democracy works at its best, where
yeah,
many points of view come together and we consider it. And we maybe take time to ourselves to think about how we feel about it without anyone yelling and being like, but no, but yes, blah. Um, and then we come back together and we try to have decision making that accounts for as many points of view as we can and reach compromises rather than saying the strongest one wins. The person who has the loudest voice wins. And I certainly don't think that, you know, libraries don't really provide models for, like, say, voting, like how do you do voting, but they do provide a model for considering many points of view in a way that is contemplative and exploratory rather than dogmatic and
yeah,
condemnatory.
yeah. Well, I have so many thoughts, like my head is ready to explode about just, the current change in administration and just some of the things that we're seeing, which, are my beliefs, but they may differ from other people's. But, when you think about authoritarianism, and sort of you said another quote like nothing threatens authoritarianism like a quiet place to explore knowledge, which of course, which is what you've been talking about a lot today. And I suspect that fundamental value, like free expression, rings true for a lot of people on the call today. Um, and so when you think about sort of the need to preserve libraries as a template to rebuild cultural life together when this culture war is over, if it ever is over, and you think about this current administration, what can we do to start the kind of the rebuilding process? Like I really appreciate what you said earlier about like there's not necessarily a playbook, right? Say more to like how can we start this process of rebuilding our communities, especially in the face of what's happening right now in politics and in our country?
I mean, first of all, I'm going to say to kind of return to what I was talking about with Indigenous archives, it's very important for libraries to take seriously the fact that they are places where history is preserved. And there are a lot of groups in the United States right now who are being targeted by the current presidential regime, like trans and queer people, like Indigenous and Black people, like immigrants. And those are groups whose history is going to be rewritten and taken away by official organizations. We already see in Florida, for example, where Black history, the history of slavery, is no longer going to be taught in school in the same way or at all. Um, so it's very important that as we think about building collections in libraries, that you think about what kinds of books are going to need to be available in libraries that people may not have access to in school anymore, that they may not have access to in public discourse anymore. Because there is nothing more cruel psychologically to a community than to have their history erased. It is a form of psychological violence, and it is really, really important that future generations of little immigrant kids and queer kids understand that their elders were there and were fighting for them too, and that they're not the first to deal with this stuff. So that's really, really important. I think also, and again, these are all things that I know libraries are already doing, of course, but I think taking seriously the fact that libraries are a social space and they're this third space where people can find community. So thinking about events that can happen at the library that can help support communities that may be feeling precarious or under threat. So whether it's even just having a night where people can do knitting together in one of the
Yeah,
library's
yeah,
gathering rooms, thinking about opening up to more programs for unhoused people if that's possible, because that's going to be another group that's going to be even more mistreated as we go forward. So I think that's really important. And then also, to the extent that people who aren't already freaking exhausted at the end of the day just from being librarians, which is really a lot of emotional labor as well as actual, labor. Um, getting involved in community organizations that are trying to ban books in school, for example, like if there's ways for librarians to go to like school council meetings, other meetings
mhm,
where community members like Moms for Liberty type groups are coming in and presenting false information about books. What we've found, I'm involved with a group called Authors Against Book Bans, and they have a really great track record of sending authors to, school board meetings, to library board meetings, just to say, like, here's the author of this book you're thinking
yep,
about
yep,
banning. Like, put a face to the name. And they found that that's incredibly effective when people who are scared by a book can just meet the author. So to the extent that the library can work with those other kinds of organizations and maybe bring in authors, especially children's authors and young adult authors, because their books are the ones that are often really under fire. I think that is fantastic. And like, don't don't stop having things like drag queen story hours to the extent. I mean, obviously, keep yourself safe. Like, it's important, very important to keep the librarians safe and to keep the library safe. And if you feel like having a drag queen, story hour is gonna cause violence, then don't. But if you can, it's really important to keep showing that there's support for groups that are being, you know, gaslit and
Yeah.
and misrepresented. So I think those are all hard but feasible things to do, and of course, no one can do all of it. And
Yeah.
yeah, and I want to finish just by saying, like, for librarians especially and folks working in libraries, like, take care of yourselves too, and like give yourself permission to like have time off, because it is true that people put a lot onto librarians and they're like, you're going to do everything, you're going to save the world. And it's like, but also you need to eat and like hydrate and have fun and go do karaoke sometimes. So I hope you're
Yeah.
doing that, everybody.
The job has changed a lot. And one of the things the foundation funded in the past year was some activities for the employees to, just have some fun at work, and that's really meaningful as they are exposed to a lot of what happens in any urban environment. In our case,
Yeah.
that's really important. Just a reminder to our audience: if you have questions, go ahead and throw them in the chat or in the Q&A. And we'll get to those in a second. But before I wrap up, Annalee, can you tell us like what other inspirations or warnings do you want people to take away from your books?
I am a big believer in the idea that things are not always going to be bad. I don't believe in utopia, but I also don't believe in dystopia. I think that we're in a phase culturally right now where we're hearing from a lot of people that believing in dystopia is realistic and rational. And, a place where there's no freedom, no options, no community, no
Yeah,
hope, that's just as unrealistic as a place that's perfect.
you
And
bet.
so I think, you know, keep in mind that we're all very stressed and we're going to be screwing up. But I also think that institutions like libraries can create communities that will sustain us. And especially right now, in-person communities, places where people can gather and feel safe and learn things are just so important. And it makes me just really happy to be able to hang out with librarians and in libraries.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I'm up here in Vancouver and was just hanging out with a librarian there. And we were just talking about how nice it is to have that option to just be in a place where books are still beloved. So I think the thing to take away is like hold on to hope, even if it's just the hope of like I'm gonna hang out with friends this weekend at the library, and we're gonna make it through this. Like our ancestors made it through much worse things, and including libraries. That's why we have the ALA Code of Ethics because librarians have been dealing with this shit for a while. So we're gonna make it. It's gonna be hard. So.
well,
Yeah.
great. I love your perspective. So we've got some questions coming in. Let's jump to those. So
Yeah.
one question was sort of the idea of psychological disarmament sounds fascinating. Can you speak more on this aside from the Indigenous archives as one way to do it?
Yeah. So one of the other things I talk a lot about in my book is ways to tell different stories. There's a lot of theories about, well, what happens when there's, harmful stories out there about, say, a marginalized group? Like, what if there's just a lot of negative stories about trans people, which it's very easy to see how that works, right? We're in
Sure.
that world right now where we're hearing lots and lots of disinformation about trans people, lots of accusations of grooming and again, which I trace this in the book back all the way to like the early 20th century. Like queer people have been accused of this same exact thing over and over again. So it's an old song. And how do we so one theory is the way that you deal with that kind of disinformation is you attack it head on and you say like, well, here's all the ways that that's wrong.
Yeah.
My suggestion is basically change the subject tell stories about trans people being awesome or, being flawed, but just regular people.
For sure.
Tell news stories. And so I talk a lot about the figure of Wonder Woman because she is a long-standing story. She's been around since the 40s, showing a figure of female empowerment, basically a woman who can be a boss and who can fight for justice. And she's always been a counter narrative to stories about how women are terrible, venal, weak-minded, unable to do anything, can't fight their way out of a paper bag, that kind of thing. And so those kinds of stories, I think, can be extremely effective, and they're very helpful for people who are suffering from psychological attack. One way to deal with psychological attack is just move over and start being part of a community, part of a story cycle that shows you in a positive light. And so I think that's a really important piece. And then another thing that I think really works for psychological disarmament, especially if you're talking about public spheres or social media, is to have really good content moderation policies. Which currently those are all being dismantled. So you can see how they lead to
Yeah.
psychological war and cultural conflict. So trying to imagine better ways of doing content management is really important.
Yep. So we'll get to Carol's question and then we'll hit Grace's question because she poses a really good one about DEI. But let's start with Carol had a question about how, what concerns do you have about books and stories being created by AI, by these sort of machine learning algorithms that generate this content?
Yeah, I mean, I was teaching a media studies course last year at University of San Francisco, and I taught AI as a form of media. I was like, this is a form of mass
Yeah,
media, like it's its own thing. I think that it is right now, of course, it's extremely dangerous on any number of fronts. I mean, what I worry about most is, writers and artists not being paid anymore, that their work is being turned into training material for AIs, and then that's being used as an excuse to
sure.
lay off journalists, to lay off artists, but also maybe to lay off librarians. Like that's one of the things that, it's like AI, you know, terrible AI programs or models, I should say, could be used to replace people. And of course, now when you go on Google, the search results start almost always with AI
AI.
slop. So I think we're in a very worrying phase. I also think that the backlash is coming sooner than you might think. I think people are already, including in the business world, they're like, what's the business case for this? It's just creating a bunch of slop and it's really wild. And it's propaganda, it's like misinformation. So I think that check back in a couple of years to see how it's all kind of fallen out. But I do think that it's going to wind up being a lot like cryptocurrency. It's going to be like a thing that people are really psyched about. They're like all investing in it. And then we're all going to be like, wait, why did we do that? And there'll be a small minority of people who are still really obsessed with it, but that it won't become something that pushes
Yeah.
actual human writers off of the field.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of attention in the segment in the sector, the library sector right now about AI, and certainly Seattle Public Library is thinking about its role around AI. And then some of our largest partners were a Microsoft community here, and I know that their nonprofit team is thinking a lot about AI and its impacts in the social sector.
Yeah.
Um, let's talk a little bit about Grace. Grace mentioned the DEI initiatives, our diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, are sort of under attack in this administration. Um, do you have a comment about the value of DEI initiatives in public libraries?
I mean, I can't overstate how valuable they are. I think that just as I was arguing that um, the public sphere of the library is enriched by having multiple points of view. The social sphere of librarianship is enriched by having multiple points of view. And the only
Yep.
way that you have multiple points of view is by having DEI. And the thing about DEI is that, I mean, it depends on how programs are implemented, but they can't just be about hiring. They're also about retention in the best case. And I think one of the things that has really fallen out of the conversation is the fact that like a lot of organizations, I mostly live in San Francisco where it's like a lot of tech companies and they've done all kinds of DEI stuff. And what'll happen is they'll bring in a bunch of people of color and immigrants and people from different backgrounds, and there'll be no support for them. So it's like, great, you're plunked onto a team with a bunch of white guys and like no one's got your back. And I don't know like how it is in the world of libraries, and I'm sure it varies a lot from library to library, but I think as we shore up our DEI programs and maintain them, that we always need to be thinking about how do we make how do we have the backs of the people that we hire
Yeah.
if especially if they may be only one or two of whatever identity they have at their organization. um, so that's I think that's a big important part. The other thing is if you don't have people from diverse backgrounds, your library collection is going to suffer too, because I know there's books that I'm familiar with because I'm queer and I'm always looking for like any book that, is going to have like awesome queer characters, or messy queer characters who are cool in an interesting way. And like, I think that that's partly just because, yeah, I'm interested in seeing stuff about me, and
Hmm.
and I would have something to contribute to like a list of like what kind of things would we want to acquire. So it's really important from like every angle, and also for patrons, you
Yeah.
want to have
Yeah. Yeah.
diverse
Representation.
languages and
Yep.
like diverse backgrounds. So I think I guess all I'm saying is heck yeah, DEI, go. Please continue with DEI. It will only make the institution stronger.
Well, I'm incredibly proud of the library's efforts at DEI, we're looking to expand them and make sure that we're listening to patrons, make sure that we're recruiting employees that reflect our community. So they're doing a
Heck
lot of
yeah.
great work there. I love a question or a comment that just came in from Mary Jean, because I love a good call to action. Do you have one idea what a regular person or citizen can do to support cultural disarmament on a regular day?
On a regular day, you can do it by in any number of ways. It can be as simple as, supporting a friend who's going through something, and just being there for them. You can contribute to a local organization, just like attend a meeting that people don't normally go to. Like
Yep.
it could be a housing planning meeting, it could be a school board meeting. And again, you don't have to do that every day, but like that could be something that you start doing. Join a local group. Like I just joined the local hackerspace here in Vancouver. Like that was one of the first things I did when I got to town. The point is to be in community with other people and be reaching out to people and not just staying online and like doom scrolling. Like we
Yep.
have to get out and make real social connections, because if AI has taught us anything, like this current AI moment, you don't know if you're online, if you're even talking to a real person half the time. They might be some kind of bot or like an operative of some kind. And what we need in these moments of authoritarianism is to get away from division, because what authoritarian leaders want to do is divide us, have us fighting with each other and distracted so that we can't see the systemic problems that are being created by our leadership. And so, you can also go to an event at your library. You can suggest to your librarian books that they might want to acquire. You can tell a better story. Like if you're a creator, you can tell stories that are about human connection and are about how marginalized groups, aren't demonic, terrible forces. There's a lot of ways to do it, but I think the main thing is to focus on just one thing. Don't
Yeah.
try to do it
Yeah.
all. Just like
Yeah.
pick a thing that
Yeah.
you're excited about and participate in it.
Take an engagement step, be engaged in some way.
Yeah.
Well, Annalee, this has been a fantastic conversation with you. The comments are flooding in, so thank you. Tell us what you're working on next.
I have a new fiction book coming out. I just turned in the final copy edits on it. It's called Automatic Noodle. And it's set in future San Francisco after California has separated from the Union and people are rebuilding. And it's about a group of robots who decide to open a noodle restaurant. And they're just dealing with like robophobia and trying to learn how to make good noodles. So it's very much focused on how do you recover from cultural trauma and how do you find a community and also just noodles. I'm like obsessed with Byung noodles, so it was just an excuse to write about noodles. And I'm right about to start my next book about history is going to be an ancient history of parties, starting about 5,000 years ago with some really badass parties in the Mediterranean. So
Great.
so look for that in the future.
Well,
And
Annalee, you are a
yeah, thanks again.
fascinating person to spend time with. We thank you for sharing your perspective and your work with our audience today. And good luck on your next projects. And sounds like you're always keeping busy with a project. So keep up the great work. And thanks for being with your friends in Seattle today.
Yeah, thank you guys again for having me. And thanks so much to the libraries for supporting awesome stuff like this. Really appreciate it.
You bet. All right. Well, Brittany, we'll turn it back to you, and you can close us out. And again, Annalee, thanks so much, and we'll be sure to have you back again with us soon.
Thanks, Brian, and thanks, Annalee. I suspect there are many of you on this conversation who, as Annalee was speaking, were saying, yes, yes, yes. I know that's how I felt. These issues matter a lot to me, and that's why I'm focused on advocacy for the Seattle Public Library. And if you're looking for one action for today, I would love to suggest that you join our plan, our Public Library Action Network. The library is funded through a combination of sources. It's through foundation donors like yourself. Your donations add about 100,000 books a year to the collection, consistent with what Annalee was suggesting about the value of collection and having a diverse collection of books. 1 in 4 books come through donation through the foundation. So if that's an approach that is available to you, donations go a long way. Similarly, our Books Unbanned initiative, which gives access to young adults across the US and territories to the Seattle Public Library's ebook and e-audiobooks collection, is funded solely through the Seattle Public Library Foundation. Where I would also like to direct your attention is in advocacy. The foundation supplements the library, but the library is funded through a combination of general funds through the Seattle City Council, which is budgeted on a regular cycle, and a levy, which is a significant and crucial part of how the library is funded. The next levy is going to take place in 2026. It's not far away. And when you think about supporting an institution as important as the library, passing that levy is absolutely essential. And so by going to the link at the bottom or using the QR code, by signing up for the plan, you'll see more of me and other foundation folks as we work to build an ongoing support network for the library. That could be writing to both local and state and federal legislators, to speaking at city events, and really just standing up for the library and the resources that are necessary for it to thrive. So thank you everyone for being here today, for supporting the library in all the ways that you do, which includes coming to the library and checking out books and spending time in a physical space. And so we look forward to having you continue supporting the library in all the ways that that's possible. Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate you being here. Take care.